I am Margaret, 70 years old, and I never imagined a family trip to Italy could turn into one of the most terrifying weeks of my life. I had been alone since Robert passed 3 months ago, still learning how to make coffee for one, still adjusting to the quiet in our home. When David, my son, and Lisa, his wife, suggested a family vacation, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was exactly what I needed: a chance to breathe, to see Florence, to feel close to them again. But the moment we arrived at the hotel, something felt off. David's smile was too practiced, too bright, and Lisa's eagerness seemed carefully measured. I remember standing in that marble lobby, watching David hand over my credit card for a family suite I hadn't even chosen, and feeling a chill I couldn't explain. The concierge offered words that should have comforted me, but instead, they made my stomach tighten. Quiet, peaceful, very private, they said. Perfect for rest. I had asked for a room with a view of the Tuscan hills, yet the window I opened faced an interior courtyard. The peaceful room was isolating, muffling every sound, as if designed to erase me from the life I had known. At dinner that evening, the polite charm of David's explanations and Lisa's nods to his words only deepened my unease. Their attentiveness felt deliberate, rehearsed. I began noticing small discrepancies in their stories, tiny shifts that made me question every intention. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number instructed me to leave quietly and not trust my son and his wife. For a moment, I froze, staring at the screen, wondering if grief had clouded my mind or if someone truly was trying to warn me. My heart pounded, and a mix of fear and disbelief swirled inside me. How could the people I loved and trusted the most possibly be the ones plotting against me? That is where my story begins. This wasn't a vacation. It was a trap. And I had to decide, in the quiet of that cold Florentine hotel room, whether I would remain a passive observer in my own life or finally fight for the independence, safety, and dignity I thought grief had taken from me. Little did I know that the events of the next days would test not only my courage, but the depth of betrayal, forcing me to confront what it truly means to survive when family becomes the enemy. And that is where our journey starts, in the heart of Florence, on a day that should have been filled with wonder, but instead was filled with questions I couldn't yet answer. Before I even left Portland, I found myself reflecting on the years I had shared with Robert. 42 years of marriage doesn't simply vanish with a funeral. The quiet mornings, our shared coffee, the subtle rhythm of our routines, all of it had shaped me, comforted me, defined my sense of home. Losing him had left more than an empty chair at the breakfast table. It had left a quiet ache in every corner of the house, in every small gesture that once carried his presence. David's voice had sounded concerned during his frequent visits in those months after Robert's death. He spoke about how lonely I must be, how traveling might do me good, how a change of scenery could lift the heaviness I felt. Lisa had agreed with the kind of enthusiasm that made me pause. I remember thinking how strange it was for her to suddenly take interest in Italian travel. The woman who complained about local grocery stores now spoke with authority about Mediterranean cuisine and vineyard tours. And yet, grief makes people vulnerable, and kindness, even the practiced kind, can feel like a lifeline. I had hesitated, unsure about leaving the quiet of my home, unsure about stepping into a world that now felt unfamiliar. But David's insistence that this would be a family trip, a chance to be together, coaxed a small spark of hope in me. The word family still carried weight, even after all that had changed. I clung to it like a fragile thread, imagining laughter shared over Italian meals, memories made in Florence, a chance to reclaim a piece of joy. The drive to the airport was quiet, each mile pulling me farther from the life I had known. I tried to focus on small things, the warmth of the sun on my hands, the sound of distant birds, but even as I watched the familiar landscapes fade behind us, there was an unease I couldn't name. Perhaps it was the unnatural perfection of David's smiles, or Lisa's sudden attentiveness. Or maybe it was just the anxiety of stepping into a new environment alone, despite their presence. During those final hours in Portland, I found myself reflecting on how much had shifted in a few short months. I remembered the grief counselor telling me that not crying in the grocery store anymore was a sign of progress. I had believed it, taken it as reassurance. Yet something in me wondered if I had grown too accustomed to trusting what I was told. Could I read the subtleties, the quiet movements that hinted at something hidden beneath the surface? The answer, I would learn, would be tested sooner than I expected. Packing my suitcase felt like packing fragments of my life, careful, deliberate. Each item a memory, a connection to who I was and who I hoped to remain. I carried photographs of Robert, a scarf he had given me years ago, a journal filled with thoughts I could barely bear to read without him. I wanted to believe that family could be a sanctuary, that David and Lisa's intentions were as pure as they claimed. Yet deep down, a whisper of doubt lingered. By the time we boarded the plane, I felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. This trip could be healing, or it could expose vulnerabilities I wasn't ready to confront. I clung to the belief that love and trust could guide me, even as subtle signals of manipulation began threading their way into the edges of my awareness. The journey was beginning, and already, I sensed that the most important lessons were not in the sights I would see, but in the truths I would uncover about those I thought I knew best. I arrived in Florence carrying both anticipation and unease, a heart still tender from loss, yet poised to notice the smallest inconsistencies. Little did I know, the moments of warmth, the gestures of care, were masking intentions that would soon challenge everything I had believed about family, loyalty, and my own strength. And that tension, that fragile line between trust and suspicion, would guide the next days of my life in ways I could never have imagined. Stepping into the Belmonte Villa San Michele in Florence should have felt like stepping into a dream. But the moment I saw the marble floors and gilded accents, a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. David had arranged everything, or so it seemed. He paid for the family suite with a flourish, his smile the same one he wore as a boy when he wanted something he knew I might hesitate to grant. Lisa followed closely, nodding as if rehearsed, her attention fixed on every detail I might notice. The room they called peaceful turned out to be a quiet cell of sorts, tucked deep in the hotel's oldest wing. My window faced a dull interior courtyard, not the sweeping Tuscan hills I had imagined. I remembered asking for a view, imagining sunsets painting the sky, and felt a flicker of disappointment. David waved my concern away with practiced charm, and Lisa echoed his words as if it were wisdom she had discovered herself. Their attentiveness began to feel calculated rather than caring. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the silence, a silence that pressed in on me rather than offering rest. Through the thin walls, I heard low voices in the adjacent room, David and Lisa talking in hushed tones, about documents I was supposed to sign. My mind raced, recalling every moment that now felt suspicious, the way David had suddenly taken over conversations about finances, the precise way Lisa had guided discussions about Italy as if she had been waiting for this opportunity. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening for clues, memories of past years sharpening my instincts. By morning, the unknown number sent another message, warning me that the appointments planned for me were a trap. I felt my chest tighten. For a brief moment, I questioned whether I was imagining it, whether grief had clouded my judgment. But the consistency of their behavior, the isolated room, the careful steering of conversations, the insistence on signing documents without full explanation told me this was real. I began to notice details that I had overlooked before, the subtle shifts in my belongings, the way papers were rearranged, how my purse had been moved slightly on the nightstand. It wasn't just a vacation. Someone had gone through my things. My mind turned over every interaction with David and Lisa in recent weeks, searching for signs, trying to untangle care from calculation. The more I observed, the more I realized that what had seemed like concern was likely preparation for something much darker. By the time breakfast arrived, my nerves were taut. David tried to steer conversations toward my confusion. Lisa underscored his points with gentle affirmations. Their concern was cloaked in kindness, but I felt the weight of intent behind every word. I thought about Robert, about the life we had built, and a protective anger rose in me. This wasn't about family bonding or grieving together. It was about control, about taking advantage of the vulnerability that grief had left in its wake. In that quiet moment, I made a decision I hadn't considered before. I would not be passive. I would watch, observe, and act if necessary. The tension in the room was palpable, but I felt a strange clarity begin to settle over me. I realized that surviving this trip would require vigilance, strategy, and a willingness to trust my instincts over appearances. Florence should have been magical, but it had become a stage, and I was learning how carefully every scene had been orchestrated. That awareness set the course for the next days. Every interaction, every smile, every word from David and Lisa would now be measured, examined, and weighed. And it was only the beginning. The trip that was supposed to heal my heart was quickly transforming into a challenge I had never anticipated, a test of trust, intuition, and courage. By the second morning in Florence, I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that this trip had been carefully planned for someone else's gain, not for my healing. When I received the second message from the unknown number, warning that the appointment was a trap and that David and Lisa were not to be trusted, a cold dread settled in my chest. For a moment, I questioned whether grief had clouded my judgment, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way I could no longer ignore. I realized the room's isolation, the carefully arranged schedule, and their repeated insistence that I trust their guidance were not acts of love, they were calculated moves. Every gesture that had seemed thoughtful before now felt like manipulation. I thought about the private conversations I had overheard through the thin walls, about the documents they had subtly steered me toward signing, and about the way they had gathered information about my finances over the past months. The realization was chilling. This was about controlling my assets, not supporting me. I remembered the grief counselor's advice, the subtle signs of progress in my own mourning, and I clung to the clarity that came from months of living independently. I would not allow myself to be dismissed as confused or incapable. I made the decision to reach out to someone I trusted, someone who had known Robert as well as I had, Elena, his old business partner, became my lifeline in that moment, a voice of reason and confirmation. She helped me understand just how carefully David and Lisa had orchestrated their plan, from isolating me in a quiet room to arranging appointments that could have given them legal control over my life. As I thought through every visit, every smile, every request David had made in the months since Robert's death, I could see how each had been a calculated step toward this goal. Their concern had been performative, their attentiveness a cover for investigation. They had been collecting evidence, documenting moments that could be framed as cognitive decline, and presenting themselves as loving caretakers. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, because it came from the two people I had trusted most in the world. I remember the sensation of sitting quietly, absorbing the enormity of what was unfolding. The world outside the hotel felt distant, almost irrelevant, as I mentally retraced each interaction, each detail of the trip, and each choice I had made in the months of grieving. I realized that acting impulsively could have been dangerous, yet inaction carried its own risks. The line between vigilance and fear became my constant companion. That day, I also recognized the unexpected strength that grief and solitude had nurtured in me. Living alone for 3 months had sharpened my instincts, giving me the ability to detect subtle manipulation, to anticipate their next move, and to plan my response. I knew I could not rely on David and Lisa's words or gestures. I could only rely on my judgment and the counsel of those I trusted. With Elena's guidance, I began coordinating with legal advisors, understanding the steps I would need to take to protect myself. Every call, every piece of evidence, and every strategic move became a tool to reclaim control over my life. In that quiet, tense space, I felt a shift from uncertainty and fear to clarity and determination. I was no longer a passive participant in their scheme. I was preparing to confront it, to turn their carefully laid plan back upon them. And in that moment, as Florence's morning light filtered through my window, I understood that the coming days would demand courage, careful planning, and unwavering belief in my own strength. This was no longer just a vacation. It was a test of resilience, and I was ready to meet it head-on. I remember the first moment I realized I couldn't just endure this trip, I had to act. Every subtle maneuver David and Lisa had executed to isolate me, to make me doubt myself, suddenly became a map of their intentions. It was clear that their concern was a performance, carefully designed to mislead anyone who might question them. I knew I needed allies, people who could help me navigate this unfamiliar terrain and turn the situation around. Elena became my anchor. Through her, I connected with lawyers who understood both Italian and American laws surrounding guardianship and elder financial abuse. For the first time in days, I felt a measure of control return. I started piecing together the evidence, the rearranged belongings, the subtle manipulation of schedules, the private conversations I had overheard, and the documents they wanted me to sign. Everything pointed to a single goal: to claim my assets under the guise of concern. I realized the only way to protect myself was to anticipate their moves. When David suggested we all go to an appointment together, I excused myself under the pretense of needing rest, careful to appear compliant while establishing a plan to move independently. I walked through the hotel gardens, observing patterns, noting who might be following. The crowd of tourists in Florence became my cover, the city streets a maze in which I could reclaim my autonomy. That day, I felt an unexpected surge of confidence. Grief had left me fragile in some ways, but it had also honed my instincts, my attention to detail, and my ability to strategize. I realized that for decades, managing a household, finances, and family crises had prepared me for this in ways I had never fully appreciated. Now, those skills became my tools for survival. I coordinated with my lawyers and Elena, arranging calls and planning my next steps. Every decision had to be deliberate. I could no longer rely on trust alone. I had to rely on proof, on strategy, and on the clarity that comes from observation and experience. I felt a strange sense of empowerment, recognizing that while David and Lisa had sought to control me, I had the ability to outmaneuver them without confrontation, without anger overtaking judgment. By evening, the framework for action was clear: gather evidence, secure legal representation, maintain composure, and avoid revealing my awareness prematurely. Florence was no longer just a destination for leisure. It had become the stage on which I would reclaim control over my life and my legacy. I reflected on the months following Robert's death, the loneliness and the quiet moments I had endured, and I realized that none of that vulnerability would be exploited without my knowledge any longer. That night, as I prepared for rest, I felt a blend of caution and determination. I understood that the coming days would test my patience, judgment, and emotional resilience. Yet, for the first time since arriving in Florence, I felt a sense of agency, a belief that I could navigate this challenge and emerge not just intact, but stronger and more self-assured. This turning point was the moment I stopped being a passive participant in my own story and began actively shaping the outcome. The courtroom in Florence felt smaller than I had imagined, yet the tension was enormous. Sitting there, flanked by my lawyers, I felt the weight of the past few days press down on me: the isolation, the manipulation, the subtle ways David and Lisa had tried to make me doubt myself. But now, I was ready. I wasn't the grieving widow they had underestimated. I was a woman who had observed, documented, and planned carefully. David and Lisa entered, their practiced concern thinly veiled, attempting to portray themselves as devoted family members worried about my well-being. The hired psychiatrist, who had been part of their scheme to question my competence, was absent, leaving their plan exposed and vulnerable. I reflected on every tactic they had tried: the quiet room, the rearranged papers, the constant framing of my actions as confused, and realized how carefully they had underestimated me. As the proceedings began, my legal team presented the evidence methodically. Every rearranged item, every subtle manipulation, every document David had attempted to have me sign became proof of their intention to deceive and control. I observed their reactions, noting how each piece of truth chipped away at their carefully maintained facade. My heart pounded, yet a calm determination settled over me. I had survived grief and betrayal before, and now I was claiming back my life. Sitting there, I thought about Robert, about the life we had shared, and about the strength that had carried me through months of mourning. I realized that this confrontation was not just about legal victory. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to determine my own path. Watching David falter under the weight of the evidence, seeing Lisa struggle to maintain composure, I felt a quiet vindication. When the judge delivered the decision, it was swift and decisive. Not only were their petitions denied, but the case was referred to prosecutors for criminal investigation, and a restraining order secured my financial independence for years to come. Relief washed over me, mingled with lingering sorrow for what I had learned about the son I had once known. The courtroom, once a place of fear, became the space where truth and justice prevailed. and I felt the full weight of that transformation in my chest. As we left the courtroom, the sun falling over Florence, I understood that the true victory was not in legal triumph alone, but in realizing my own resilience. For the first time in weeks, I felt clarity, strength, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had survived and taken control of my story. 6 months later, I found myself on the terrace of my new apartment in Tuscany, sunlight spilling over the rolling hills of olive groves and vineyards. I could see the life I had imagined with Robert in fragments, and though it wasn't the life we had shared, it was a life I had claimed for myself. I reflected on the months following Florence, on the courtroom battles, the lawyers, and the careful planning that had allowed me to protect my independence. Every step I had taken reinforced a truth I had sometimes forgotten: strength and wisdom come from experience, and resilience often reveals itself in moments of betrayal. David and Lisa faced legal consequences for their actions. The knowledge that they would answer for the harm they had tried to inflict offered a measure of closure, but more importantly, it allowed me to release the lingering fear and resentment that had weighed so heavily. I could finally breathe, knowing that my finances, my home, and my life were secure. In the quiet of my new home, I began building a foundation to help elderly victims of family financial abuse, inspired by the realization that too many people endure manipulation silently. Helping others became a way to honor Robert's memory and transform the pain of betrayal into purpose. I often think about that first message I received in Florence, the one that warned me not to trust my own family. It was terrifying at the time, but it also became the catalyst for reclaiming my life. I learned that grief and vulnerability do not have to be exploited. They can reveal courage, clarity, and a renewed sense of agency. As I sip my morning coffee, watching the sun crest the Tuscan hills, I feel at peace, and I hope that sharing this story encourages anyone listening to trust their instincts, honor their strength, and remember that it's never too late to reclaim your own story. If this story resonates, I invite you to like, share, and leave a comment about a time you overcame unexpected betrayal or found courage in the face of doubt.